In the face of the saddest, most frightening things that happen to us in life, many religious people try to bolster their courage by assuring one another that God is in charge, that God has a plan. We sing songs that give us permission to abdicate from personal responsibility. We cast everything on God, who is portrayed as a super parent in the clouds who is protecting us and providing for us. Songs like we talked about recently, His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I don't have to worry about anything. I've got a guardian angel. God's going to take care of everything. Now, I don't know how anyone has ever managed to maintain faith in a religion like that in the face of how many people we've all known and loved who died too young in a car accident or from cancer or heart disease. The news reports we see of hurricanes and earthquakes and famine. When a tornado comes through our neighboring city like Joplin and just wipes out every house in a 2-mile wide swath for 7 miles. And even really bad country music. I went to seminary right next to the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, Tennessee, and it became difficult for me to believe in a loving, omnipotent God in the presence of so much country music. But we are surrounded in our community by churches whose religion operates in very much the same way that a child's security blanket operates. They hold it close to them, and it protects them from monsters. And it works, as long as there's not actually any monsters around. It works. Once you let go of that kind of supernatural theism, then your relationship with the universe changes dramatically. We can derive, I think, perspective, encouragement, nurture from our spiritual lives, but we acknowledge that we do live in a capricious universe. Why a tornado hits one house and not another, why an earthquake destroys one community and not another. This is part of the capriciousness of the universe. And the universe is full of both natural capriciousness and moral capriciousness. We have challenges that come to us just by growing seasons and diseases, but we also have challenges that come to us because of the moral failings of human race. I've been a big fan of M. Scott Peck's all of my adult life, though I recognize that his work has a certain pop psychology dimension to it, and I think a lot of that is because his psychiatric practice was, once he was out of the military, was conducted almost exclusively with affluent patients who suffered from very first world problems. My sister, my deceased sister, grew up with us. We lived on the hanging by your fingernails cliff of the middle class. We lived in a middle class neighborhood, but money was always scarce, and we were very careful with our resources. But she married well. She married a heart surgeon. She became very wealthy. And talking to my sister on the phone, she could just be so sad and so sorrowful that the gardener just didn't seem to understand what she wanted done in the yard. And the maid, she was suspicious, was stealing some of her boys' clothes. And the cook just stole some of her country ham. You know, she was always sad and grief-stricken from very, very multi-millionaire problems. You know, and I'm a poor graduate student in seminary listening to this stuff. But I can say I was trained in counseling at Vanderbilt University, and Vanderbilt is not one of those places that, even though there was a lot of conversation about poverty and civil rights and racism, I can't say that my counseling professors were really preparing me for my first clinical setting, which was doing counseling in a rural mental health center in Kentucky, where they sent people suffering from mental retardation and severe psychoses that were court-ordered to come to me for counseling. And I I sat in the room looking at them more confused than anyone they could have possibly talked to, because I was prepared to deal with the depressed housewife from middle-class America. But why this mentally retarded man kept hitting people at exceptional industries, I really didn't have a clue how to deal with that. So when Peck writes that we have to accept that our lives are the sum total of the decisions that we have made, the choices that we have made, I can feel a lot of people bristling at that, because a lot of the worst things that happened to us were not our choices. A lot of them just came to us, either through the capriciousness of the universe or through the evil that is inherent in human relationships. Many of us have been seriously hurt by people that we trusted and loved, but not by our own choice. But even still, you take what Peck said, which I offered as our wisdom reading today because I think it is true enough to be said in public. You go to the opposite extreme, the writings of Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor. And Viktor Frankl would say, and Frankl, if you don't know him, is very worth reading. Man's Search for Meaning and The Unheard Cry for Meaning, very, very worth reading. But he was a psychiatrist in Austria. He was married, but he and his wife, his mother, his brother were captured as Jews and sent eventually to Auschwitz. And as they were being processed, he was separated from his wife and he never saw her again. And they took away his clothes and they took away his shoes. And he kept clutching to his chest the manuscript of a book that was his life's work. He still believed, even stripped naked, that he was going to be able to hold on to his manuscript, and at least all of his life wasn't meaningless. And a soldier ripped that manuscript from his arms and tore it up right in front of him. So he was forced to realize that whatever he thought life held for him, it didn't anymore. None of that was his choice. None of it. No decision of his landed him in this camp where his mother and his brother and his wife would all die, and where he would suffer every form of deprivation and humiliation possible for a human being. But even there, Frankl concluded, that the Nazis could take everything away from him except for his ability to decide how he was going to react to it. He was still in charge of his own attitude, his own perspective, his own interpretation of the meaning of his life. How he thought, how he felt, how he would even react to torture was his decision. So I'm going to defend what Scott Peck says, that even though a lot of our pain and suffering has come from dishonest relationships or an unfair career move, still we are empowered to decide how we are going to react to it. And Frankl says he saw some of his people become absolute moral monsters. The actual day-to-day operation of the gas ovens in which millions of Jews were killed was mostly operated by Jewish volunteers who volunteered to operate the ovens in exchange for food and a little bit better treatment and maybe not getting killed. He watched as others committed suicide. He even set up a suicide watch within the camps to try to be sensitive to which people were just going to give up and who was literally starving themselves to death. You would see people giving away what little rations that they had because they had chosen that death by starvation was at least an innocent death. It wasn't direct suicide, but it was an innocent death. But he concluded in that pit of hell that if you have a why to live, that you can live with almost any how. Now, he continued to believe that his wife might be alive. She didn't know that he was alive. He didn't know whether she was alive or dead. But he believed that the future expected something of him. And so surviving day after day in that context made sense because he had a reason to live. And that is a choice as well. We are not simply naked apes looking for the next banana. We have a choice to live a purposeful life, a meaningful life, to have a reason for our existence that goes beyond merely not dying. Now, not many people could muster the kind of intellectual power and discipline to choose their way through the suffering that Frankl did. But he later wrote the profound observation that you've heard me say before, and I come back to it often in my own life, and that is that suffering behaves like a gas. It will expand to fill whatever space you're willing to give it. How much of your life do you want to give to the people that have hurt you, to the things that have disappointed you, to the tragedies that have befallen you? I'm not saying that they're not real. I'm not saying that there's not misogyny. I'm certainly not saying that there's not racism. It's not that there's not homophobia. We have been victimized by the world, but how much of a victim do you want to be? How much of that victimization are you willing to let define you? I think it's profoundly important that in the gospel narratives that the resurrected Jesus still has nail holes in his hands and a spear piercing in his side. In that metaphorical context, the inflicting of suffering, the victimization is real, and it doesn't make any sense to deny it and say that it goes away. However, how much space in your skull do you want to rent to your critics and your enemies? How much space do you want to give to it? The suggestion being, how much suffering do you really want to continue to live over and over and over again? That really, really horrible things happen. That's inevitable. Your misery, however, that is your choice. Now, it's not easy to choose otherwise, but it's still your choice. Speaking existentially, being a minister is something like being a politician who has to run for re-election every Sunday morning. A lot of the worst things that has happened to me in my adult life can be traced to the capricious and sometimes sociopathic aspects of church politics and the whole game of popularity. Still, I recognize that it's entirely my choice. If I want to store up resentments, if I want to keep reliving the friendships that suddenly ended or the abandonment or the feeling of betrayal, do I want to keep throwing another log on that fire of resentment? Or do I want to let it go? Do I want to dwell on the past? Or do I want to look towards the future? I can give almost all of my time and energy, sleepless nights, to reflecting about disappointments from the past. Or I can find enthusiasm and energizing new visions of a better future. I've lived in this small city for 23 years. I've served on dozens of community boards. I've been involved in higher education, both on boards and in teaching. I've been in journalism. I've published more than 1,000 columns. I've been involved in city politics. And there are times when I go into a restaurant here in Springfield and I take a look around and I can see a half a dozen people with whom I've had conflicts that, if Charles Darwin had been aware of them, he would have given up on his views of evolution. He would have accepted that the human psyche has not evolved 1 inch. Bitterness, anger, desire for revenge, deep and impenetrable cynicism are all on the menu in those restaurants when you look around and you see people that you'd really like to never see again. And sometimes there's a certain catharsis involved in wallowing in those emotions of cynicism or thoughts of revenge, but it's very temporarily satisfying. In the end, it becomes evident that harboring resentments is like drinking poison in hopes that it will hurt your enemy. There's an ancient Roman proverb that says in Latin, adversus solum nelequitur, which is don't bother criticizing the sun, or don't speak ill of the sun. Or from our domestic founding father and philosopher, Ben Franklin, who said, everyone talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it. There is a certain isness to the world. There are things that just are. There's an isness to the world. There's an isness to social relationships, to friendships, to families. The sun is hot, but cursing the sun for being hot does not affect the sun. Obsessing about the weather does not change the weather, it just makes you kind of obsessional. People are often unfair, unkind, irrational, or even cruel, but you still get to decide how you're going to react to the irrational, cruel, injustice, or insanity of the world. It's still your choice. These past weeks, we've witnessed multiple school shootings with relatively little public outcry for the kinds of changes to gun laws that have successfully prevented these kinds of events from taking place in any other developed nation in the world. Many of us believed after the Sandy Hook massacre that America would finally wake up and make some rational changes. But we didn't. We didn't. And so most of the people that thought that gun reform was inevitable after Sandy Hook have now just almost shrugged their shoulders in acquiescence. Even the producer of Bowling for Columbine was contacted after one of these recent school shootings, and he just said, I've said everything that I'm going to say on that topic. I have nothing new to say. Until Americans are tired of seeing their children shot and murdered, there's nothing new to say. 11 years ago, many of us here participated in public protests of the buildup to the war with Iraq because it was obvious that the war was being prosecuted on the basis of trumped-up evidence, out-and-out lies, and for all of the wrong reasons. And it was entirely evident that the whole invasion and occupation would be a colossal failure. Now, as we've watched Iraq being plunged into civil war after we have lost more than 4,000 lives and $2 trillion to effect a regime change there, there is no satisfaction to be derived by patting ourselves on the back and saying that we were right all along. It's still sad. Yeah, we were right, but it's still sad that that country is being plunged into civil war again. Yet the reflexive reaction for many of us may be to just stop caring because it seems hopeless. Many people will quite understandably conclude that the way to avoid the pain of such insane social failures is to stop reading the news, to stop getting involved, and to try to surround yourself with entertaining distraction, as if surrender itself were somehow a strategy. But I got to tell you, giving up is the real problem. As Plato said, the price of indifference is to be ruled by evil men. In the face of shallow friendships, the substantive response to a shallow friendship is for you to be a better friend. In the face of treachery, dishonesty, wanton, sociopathic, emotional terrorists, the only real way to change the world is for you to be more sane, more mature, a more loving actor in the world. In the face of bad government, illegal wars, greedy corporations, and inept media, indifference is not a solution. Indifference is the enemy. Peace without justice is just surrender. That is why, even in a progressive church, the cross remains a relevant symbol. Sometimes we must bait the trap for evil with our own flesh. There is no quitting. There is only trying harder. We may be victimized against our own will, but we should not become passive so that we become allies to those that want to victimize ourselves or the rest of the world. We will not accept the role of being second-class citizens. We must be actors for substantive change. That's just my opinion. I could be wrong.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.